Good afternoon. My name is Martin Butler. I'm a lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch Business School in lovely Cape Town in South Africa. And it's my privilege to speak to you this afternoon from the Kruger National Park. You'll have to excuse me. I'm going to switch off my video feed now. The reason for switching off the video feed is not to stop you from being envious about my dark tan that I received, although it's raining in Cape Town. The sun is shining along the coast and upcountry in South Africa. But I'm currently sitting on a 3G modem in the Kruger National Park. And I just want to make sure that the sound and the death by PowerPoint comes through properly. The challenge that I'm sitting with is that I am currently with my family on vacation, but I promised Sam and David and all the slave drivers from the MBOC consortium that I would do the presentation today. And the picture that you are looking at the moment, I took on my mobile phone just over an hour ago. It's even slightly delayed heading into the session because that herd of elephant needed to cross the road. And I took the picture prior to joining you from Satara Rest Camp in the Kruger National Park. The topic that I chose to share is the lasting impact of digitization. And I would like to start off just very quickly to talk about digital disruption, then about normality or the new normal, some of the impacts around employees, and I'd like to wrap up just mentioning what I believe is going to be the most fundamental lasting impact from a technology perspective, and that is ecosystems thinking. That is not a new concept, but it's a concept that I believe that will be widely dispersed amongst all types of businesses and not some of the unicorns that we've seen over the last couple of years. So for digital disruption, I just like to contextualize very, very quickly using the words of the late Clayton Christensen. And he was the first to probably in a very succulent way, or a very succinct way rather, define it and saying it's not unusual for big corporations to dismiss the value of disruptive technologies if it does not reinforce the current company goals. And I think universities like University of Stellenbosch and all the universities that you are studying with are prime examples. Most of our business model has remained intact over the last 100 years. We've certainly brought technology into the classroom, but when the technology does not necessarily support a fundamentally different business model, we believe that that is for LinkedIn or the Khan Academy or all the other interesting technological service providers. So often you're then blindsided as the technology matures, gains a lot of audience and market share, and it then threatens the status quo. And of course, MBA management textbooks are full of examples of companies like Kodak, Goldwyn Mayer, and Mr. Video. But the reality is also that those companies were managed by a lot of MBAs when they failed to see disruptive technology and the digital transformation. Now, the one mistake that we sometimes do as managers and organizations we stumble over the terminology digitalize, and digital transformation. And I've used this very successfully when I start engaging in my consulting work with businesses, just to say is you have to move on from digitizing, because digitizing is when we took an entire set of Encyclopedia Britannicas and we put that on an Encarta CD or set of DVDs. And digitizing is when we took an LP and we put that on a CD, and both of those products were to some extent superior on certain performance parameters. But the moment that you transform and you do a digital transformation, something fundamentally different happens. Both the Encyclopedia Britannica and Encarta don't exist anymore, but a service like Wikipedia is going from strength to strength and filling to an extent the void left by these traditional products. But the business model for Wikipedia is fundamentally different from the prior business models. If you look at a service like iTunes, same there. The product is fundamentally different. I don't have to go to a physical location or even download an entire set of songs. I just assemble on the fly wherever I am with at a moment's notice exactly the playlist, and I curate the music that I would like from various artists. I cover it around in a small device. And that's then what we call the digital transformation. And I use two old examples like Wikipedia and iTunes, which are more than a decade old, because it explains to us that the concept of digital transformation has been around for a while. And I think what we have seen in the COVID pandemic, it's not necessarily that there are now brand new concepts that emerges in the business world, and everybody is now jumping on that. I'm always reminded about the words from William Gibson. William Gibson is a very famous science fiction writer, and he said the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And what we've most definitely seen in the COVID pandemic is this uneven distributed future was distributed significantly quicker over a vast amount of organizations. The essence is that digitization is about technology. When you digitize, you think about technology and the first challenges. And if you're busy with digitization projects within your environment and the discussions are technology intrinsic, then it's digitizing, it's not digital transformation. What was interesting, if you attended the prior session from Johan and Gerard, there was a lot of technology embedded within the conversation, but Johan and Gerard shared the value that they gained from doing things different in the mine. It was not about doing the same things, it was about doing things different. It was about business value in their operating model, and the technology was just a vehicle with which they achieved these changes then. And the transformation then is about creating new value. What can we do that was not possible before? Now, when we think about the digital transformation, we always think of three axes. We always think about the digital transformation as being the value proposition. That's the first one that jumps to mind, the new bundles or portfolios of value that we assemble. In the bookstore, the value was the book on the shelf and the knowledge of the clerk behind the counter. In Amazon, the value is significantly more. It's still the book, but it's the online reviews. It's the ability to get that immediately. It's the fact that I can share it on multiple devices, that I can read and synchronize over multiple devices, and that I can change the size of the font. I can have it in an audio book, and all of a sudden, although I'm still consuming the latest bestseller, the value proposition is significantly different. That is fairly well understood and normally the starting point for digital transformation. Next in line is the operating model, how we configure ourselves. A lot of organizations are busy with this, sometimes struggling a little bit in terms of the configuration, because this configuration is not about the internal structure or the organogram of the organization, if you wish. This organization is about how do we structure the entire portfolio of service delivery amongst all of the partners within the ecosystem of delivering value, which traditionally was the business or the suppliers suppliers, the typical score model that we look in the supply chain. But these days things work fundamentally different. You use the on-air platform to arrive at this particular presentation. I'm from the University of Stellenbosch Business School. I'm using infrastructure from the Kruger National Park. You are sitting dispersed all across the world. We're using a platform on-air provided, but even on-air don't do their own video conferencing. They have embedded Zoom within that. And there's a perfect example of ecosystems thinking, because on-air didn't want to create another video communication platform, but they wanted to create a shell within which we can do something like the IMBA conference, the IMBA week or a conference, and they just then partner with other service providers. And the same is then true for IMBA as well. We didn't create all of these things. We selected on air with Zoom, with all of our partner schools, and that's how we configured our operating model. And then probably the least appreciated part, although it bites us quite often, is the digital capabilities of our workforce. It's the digital capabilities right down to the process level that we quite often remember. We do skills and capacity development programs with all of our employees, but we forget that there are people sitting in the boardrooms which are 40 years old, 50 years old, and 60 years old. They did not study online. They did not work online in virtual teams. There are many of the things that they are now managing and taking decisions about that they have never I found myself in University of Stellenbosch Business School, sitting in a management meeting. People were making discussions about virtual programs, and I would then ask a team of senior managers, how many of you have completed an online course in the last 2 or 3 years? Unless you have completed an online course in whatever area you would like, you don't have the skills and the capabilities to partake in that particular conversation. We can have the conversation about the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement, because we work with money every day. But we must make sure that those in management positions within our organizations have the digital capabilities to ensure astute decision making about all of the digital things that is happening all around us. And obviously, this hits across all industries. Quite often students would say, well, that's not necessarily the case in my particular industry. I think you have just seen a beautiful example of the mining industry, but we can go from industry to industry to industry. And I think something like transport, Tesla is such a great example of a company that's just not about manufacturing the car. They have a connection right down to the end consumer like no automotive corporation has had in the history of humankind. Even when Henry Ford built the Model T Ford, the Model T Ford drove away. They know the name of the owner, but that was the end of the relationship. Tesla has got a relationship directly with the owner, and there's a lot of value that sits within that relationship, although there's obviously a lot of complexity associated with that as well. And my final salvo then, in terms of the digital transformation and not the COVID pandemic, but the world of normal leading into the COVID pandemic, was some lovely research from Deloitte, where they said that the most frequent words that appears in companies' mission statements is actually innovate and technology. And probably the word solution, which I'm not a very big favorite of, probably refer to some extent to innovation as well. So digital transformation was no doubt busy reshaping industry and society prior to the COVID pandemic as well. And the question is then if we've had this really, really interesting event, and we had business as normal, although we all appreciate that business as normal kept on accelerating. There was a brilliant book from Chris Zook talking about meantime between surprises and how meantime between surprises kept on shrinking. Windows of opportunity kept on shrinking. Strategy execution became significantly more complex, but still there was an element of normality. And although the pace of change was quite rapid, it was the norm and people were happy with that. All of a sudden, there was a global event. This global event meant that many of you sitting within this call now had visions 6 months ago of being in different places in the world and attending your EMBO week in different places of the world, which would bring other interesting nuances, which I will elaborate on shortly. But there's now a new way of doing business. And the question that many of us are dealing with is will it be a return to normality, or we would just return back to where we came from, be it that where we came from was not an easy place to do business in many industries, or will there be a new normal? Will there be, most certainly, a return to some elements of how we used to do business, but there will also be some new elements that will emerge from this doing business during the pandemic. And if I can use one example, I remember 2 years, or it may even be 3 years ago, sitting on an EMBA council meeting in Italy, and the EMBA business model, and a lot of kudos to Jose and the team. The EMBA business model worked brilliantly. The students loved it and everything. And we said this, but should we do a second week? Should we do something more? What do we do? All of a sudden, this year has forced EMBA into a virtual conference, which we're running this year. And a lot of appreciation for David and then for Jose and everybody involved, EPEC, and this entire effort to make sure that we can do that. And that's our doing business here during the pandemic. And the question that we should then ask ourselves as a consortium, as every business should ask as well, is what happens in 2021? We have vaccine, the world returns to some level of normality. Do we go back to the EMBA model that has worked extremely well for us for the previous 9 years? Or do we do a hybrid and we create a new normal because we recognize that For example, people like Gerard and Johan. Gerard and Johan in South Africa are located 1,400 and 1,600 kilometers away from the business school campus in Stellenbosch. So with our prevalent mindset of the previous 9 years, we would not have Gerard from the mine and Johan from McKinsey speaking to us because that didn't fit into our mindset. Yes, we would find business leaders from around Stellenbosch, but that may have inhibited us from using what I think is one of the best examples of digital transformation in the Southern Hemisphere to be shared with the IMBA students. Now, there's 3 hangers that I have. I want to make 3 arguments here. And the 3 hangers that I have is around 3, to an extent, theoretical concept. The first concept is that I believe that innovation is people implementing new ideas to create value within a particular context. I've read so many books on innovation, and there's so many deeply academic definitions around innovation. And sometimes I find that they add a lot of complexity, but they don't distill it to the simplicity of innovation. Because ultimately, an innovation is purely ideas from a particular context that get executed, and we create an element of value. Then we have the innovation diffusion theory. The innovation diffusion theory is not new. In actual fact, it's nearly 60 years old, 58 years old, when Emmerich Rogers explained to us that whenever there's a new innovation over a period of time, it would merge into the business world. And then the final one that probably all of you have seen, but that I turned to recently when I tried to make sense of all of this, is the Gartner hype cycle. The Gartner hype cycle has been around for a long time. I'm sure every executive MBA student somewhere in a module around technology or futures dealt with the Gartner hype cycle, but we'll have a look at that shortly. So if I look at the innovation perspective, many innovations actually falter within the execution phase. It is said that if you go to Silicon Valley, and I hope there's a lot of students from San Jose in this call, if you walk around in Silicon Valley and you kick the nearest bush, 10 great ideas are jumping from the bush. The challenge there is the execution. It's the ability to actually take that idea, get funding for the idea, and have people that can execute the idea. And that's why Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were such brilliant business partners initially, because Steve Jobs was a brilliant idea person and Steve Wozniak was an excellent executor. And between the two of them, they actually did an amazing job of taking ideas and pushing it through that implementation or doing phase. And the one thing that we have seen is that the COVID pandemic has led to a quick acceleration of many ideas through the doing phase. I would venture to say that if somebody came up with the idea of a virtual IMBA consortium to be a complementary product with our normal week, it is highly likely if we came up with that idea 12 months ago, I'm not entirely sure we would have done it this year. We may have done it next year or the year thereafter. It was not as if we were not going to do that, but we didn't have the same level of urgency to push it through this. And I'm sure David will forgive me. Luckily, I know he's logged in as an attendee and not a panelist, so he can't speak to me. But David will forgive me by saying that I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, a lot of the presenters in schools were still jittery and not entirely sure whether we will pull this off because it was new to us. We haven't done this before. It's a team of people globally working together. But through persistence, hard work, and determination, we are here, and as far as what I can hear, the week is going splendidly. And that is the reality of pushing things through the do phase. What it means is come this Sunday, we know a lot more than what we would have known if we spoke about this in the boardrooms for the next 20 years. In the world of innovation, we have moved from the innovation funnel and the sequential process into a more iterative kind of fashion. And this iterative kind of way of thinking is where we learn quickly, we apply that quick learning back in, and I can promise you we've learned a lot in the last couple of weeks to present what you see in front of you now. Now, the second hanger that I would like to use is then the notion of innovation diffusion. And I find that people quite often don't necessarily understand the graph. And I hear that when you bring new technology, you need to do change management. And I hear change management, and I then ask, so what is the impact of change management? And I'd like to display it visually by using a hypothetical project. Let's say we deploy some new technology. And if we deploy the new technology and we go through a typical innovation diffusion curve, and 7 months into this new ERP system or digital twinning of the mine or whatever major technology project we are doing, we flick a switch and we need to start using the technology. You'll find that only the innovators and a couple of the early adopters are on board. So now 10% of the employees have the digital capabilities, but the desire to use the technology, and 10% are carrying the can for you while you have to threaten, lick and kick and incentivize 90% to be part of this particular project. All that successful change management is doing, it is just changing the time scale. So at the bottom, I'm still going through the exact same curve, but now the innovators are on board earlier, as is the early adopters, the early majority, and all that has happened, it's still the same curve, it's the same amount of people, but we find that the time scale is quicker. And if I now go live with this new initiative of mine after 7 months, you would find that 90% of the users are on board, and all of a sudden the project is fundamentally different. Now, if we look at the theoretical principles of what Everett Rogers has said, he says that this theory that he published in 1962, that's become a seminal in management works that we've seen in many, many documents, it's over time participants in a social system help with the adoption of new ideas. And the social system relies heavily on human capital in order to self-sustain it until there's a point where it reaches the critical mass. And of course, it's dependent on the innovation, the communication channels, the time, but ultimately it is the social system that helps us to ensure that this innovation is actually materializing. So the lasting impact of COVID, I believe, is a self-sustaining social system. Thank you, Roshana. I can see your card. There's a self-sustaining social system of remote work, remote learning, virtual presence, online commerce, business ecosystems. You can add whatever you would like in there. But these social systems mean that a professor at a business school globally that taught online was part of the minority a year ago. A year ago, if you applied for a position in the business school, you say, oh, I teach blended classes, I teach online and all of that. It was kind of a bit of a competitive advantage because it was not something commonly embraced by academia and not used by all academics. 6 months later or 12 months later, you would not find employment today if you don't have that ability, period. And that's a self-sustaining social system. It's not sniggered at, it's not smiled at, it is revered, and we all appreciate that it is a skill that does not replace being able to facilitate brilliantly in a classroom like Professor Andre Roux, but it's a skill that you need to have on top of that ability to find employment in your future area. And the last hanger that I then have to place this on is the Gartner Hype Cycle. It's a fairly busy slide, but in this busy slide, if you've never seen the hype cycle before, which is probably not true for an executive MBA student, we talk about technologies, and this is now technologies, not necessarily bundles of systems, but technologies go through these hypes, and ultimately we find you second generation products and third generation products going through a slope of enlightenment and a plateau of productivity. And what we have seen with COVID, if you look at what we have used, for example, Skype, irrespective of Microsoft buying Skype, and in my humble opinion, ruining it. Skype, I think, comes from 2009, so it's only 11 years old, but that was a first generation product that was highly hyped. If we looked at products like Zoom and Teams, whether it's second or third generation products, or whether it was a second generation product 6 or 12 months ago and it's now a third generation product, what we do know is that COVID-19 accelerated the movement of second generation products through the slope of enlightenment onto the plateau of productivity at a tremendous pace. And it would be fairly interesting. Gartner always has different icons on this curve where they would indicate the time to maturity, how quickly things would move through the curve. And it would be really interesting to see the latest ones that is appearing. This is in the references on my slide deck. There are 8 different references. There's a couple of really interesting readings from McKinsey and from Boston Consulting Group. And I love this quote from a survey that Boston did. They surveyed 12,000 employees about the future of remote work. And importantly, people that have worked remotely significantly in the past and continue to do that. Those that work, that stay on premises, so certain workers, so the easiest would be healthcare workers, but many other roles as well. So they worked on premises and they kept on working on premises. And then the majority of the respondents are those that worked on premise and needed to work remotely. So they had these 3 groups of employees. And I love this quote. They said it's the world's biggest ever workplace experiment, because a lot of what we have learned over the last 6 months really has the notion and the taste of an experiment. And although it's only data from the United States, Germany, and India, I think it's a lovely representation of a large part of the world because of the different demographics within the United States, Germany, and India. And I'll take you back to the results of that survey shortly. So I decided to Google for an image of work. And I was quite surprised, because in South Africa, if you go into google.co.za and you Google work, this is what you get. Not a single person doing physical work. If you Google the word work, it's sitting behind a laptop and collaborating and working. And I found that absolutely fascinating, because I was expecting something like that to appear as well. We still build roads, we still harvest, sometimes manually. We still do many things. And for many people, that is still work. But in the common, in the internet lingo, work actually moved to things that we do online. And I think one of the lasting impacts of the COVID pandemic is that we will start redefining and rethinking work. And I always tell my students, so my apologies for all the USB students on this call, but I always tell my students that within one generation, the word work changed completely. When I was a child, work meant the place that my father and mother went to. See, my father is at work, my mother is at work, or my father is working, or my mother is working, always signified the place where they were busy. If you ask my children, they would say that's what my father is doing in his laptop while we're on vacation in the Kruger National Park. He is working. It's not the place that he is, or it's what my father and mother are doing in the evenings at home, or where they're sitting at home. And our management control systems was designed 100 years ago for a physical presence. And we have to think about how do we control work in an environment where the time and the location has become completely flexible and permeable. It may still be within this environment, and it may not necessarily be within the environment. And the Boston Consulting Survey was quite interesting. It's not as if all employees want that flexibility. 39% of them says no, not necessarily, but you can see that 60% of respondents said they would love to have the flexibility in terms of where they work and when they work. And that would mean, if we look at all of our business environment, we need to move away from preparing the cafeterias, the open spaces, the green spaces, the gardens, the offices, and all. Shana, I see I get a Zoom message that my internet is unstable. If you could just give me a thumbs up if you can still hear me. That's not good. Can you hear me, Roshana? Okay, thank you so much. I think I'm still online. So 60% of respondents say they would love to have this flexibility, and it's then important for us as employers to design the same kind of interactions and support structures as well for the environments that we are in. And fairly simple things like normally corporate policies and things are pushed down to laptops that's connected to the local area network. What if my laptop is never on campus for 6 months? Are all of thank you, Roshana. Are all of the company policies still enforced? Are everything still in place? And do I present the same level of infrastructural support and social connection for employees that work remotely as well? And this for me was the real defining factor of that study. a lot of people that transitioned, and you can see the three categories here at the bottom: staying on site, stayed remote, and this is the category that we're intrigued by, the third bar, the transition to remote. And what they said, they are more productive on individual tasks. Now, I think that embedded within that 24%, we know that not all environments are equal. Single parents with small children need to onboard homeschooling, many other responsibilities, has an impact across the board. But still, in general, for the respondents, the vast majority said more productive on individual work, more productive on managerial tasks, but less productive on collaboration work. And I think that's the important aspect for us, is because if we think about innovation, it's quite often about groups of people sitting, mingling. We know how many great ideas was born around a cup of tea or a glass of pinotage or a cold beer. Apologies, pinotage is South African wine. Let me rephrase: a glass of lovely South African red wine or a cup of tea. And people were sitting and they're having a conversation. And we find that collaborative tasks, irrespective of all of the brilliant technologies that we use, that people find themselves being less efficient in collaborative tasks. And that's one of the challenges that will remain then for organizations, is how do I make myself still productive in collaborative tasks if employees have the opportunity to work where and when they would actually like. Now, the defining factor here that they pointed to was social connectivity. And I think that will probably be one of the biggest challenges for us moving forward. And the challenge is that people saying that social connectivity is a bit of a challenge for us. When they are being less productive, we quite often find it's that social connectivity. I feel completely comfortable working with Rushana online, that you guys can't necessarily see. Rushana is one of our panelists, but I've met Rushana in person. I've had a cup of coffee with Rushana. I know her for 3 years. She was one of our top MBA students, and she's one of the proudest products that we have at University of Stellenbosch Business School. But because I have a social connection with Rushana that I've built up in the real world, it translates well in the online world. I trust her, she trusts me, and we work well together as a team online. And that is a challenge that we're sitting with, is a lot of the success for collaborative work online was built because teams of people moved remotely. The moment that you meet online, that challenge becomes bigger, and it's something that we need to think about as organizations. The third impact for me is the skills that will be required in this new world of work. And I was actually wondering about that when I stumbled via an article that the BBC published, I think a week or two ago. I tweeted it, and the BBC article actually has a hyperlink to the academic article from Purbach Nova, Charlier, Reeves, and Greco. And they did what I believe is a fascinating study. They looked at groups of people that are bundled together and then asked who is the emergent leaders. Now, you will excuse me from using EMBA again, but it's such a perfect example for me. Many of you guys on the diploma track have to do an analysis of a company, and then you need to do a presentation on Friday. When you do that presentation on Friday, it will be a culmination of 2 weeks' work, but somebody needs to take a leadership role. And we didn't in EMBA say, you are the leader or you are the leader. So we talk about emergent leaders. Emergent leaders are team members who exert influence over their teammates without having formal authority. They were never appointed as a team leader. Maybe the team self-organized and appointed them. But emergent leaders means those that in normal circumstances take the lead. And what they found in this really, really interesting study with a very large sample, in the physical environment, the emergent leaders have confidence, intelligence, and they are especially extroverts. So the extroverts, they don't feel uncomfortable to speak up immediately. They are sharp, they get everything, and they are confident about their abilities. They don't hide into the corner. They quite often become the emergent leaders. In the virtual environment, it's those that are organized, those that are dependable. They tell you that they're going to do something, and then they do it. Thank you so much, Shana. And those that are productive. Now, it's not as if these are polar opposites. It's just these are the strongest traits within the individuals that actually take this lead, which means that if we employ in the future for this digitized and virtual environment, we need to find the employees that are organized, dependable, and productive. The confident and extroverts are not necessarily going to be the leaders of online groups. And what they also did in the study, they had groups that work physical and virtual, and then none of these dominated. So in essence, you need all of these traits, but if the team is more virtual, the organization, dependable and productive, becomes the defining factors. And I love the quote here at the bottom. I normally don't do lengthy quotes on my slides, but I love this one. It says, the ascendance of worker bees to remote leadership roles may provide validation and even relief to the legions of hard workers who have for generations watched charming colleagues rise to the top. Isn't that a lovely quote? So of course, being an extrovert and being confident is lovely, but those that are actually doing the work are doing very, very well online. So the fourth impact for me is how do we measure and manage performance? It's not my area of expertise, so I'll move over the slide very quickly. I think we need to move away from talking about cost to company to value to company. We always employ somebody and say, what is the cost to company? I think that's the wrong question to ask. We need to ask, so what is the value? We need to move away from human resources and capital. I find in many of the new ecosystems companies that they don't have human resources companies. I remember visiting Skype in 2010, exactly a decade ago, and one of the students who was with me at Skype asked him a question about human resources. And Stem Tamviki, one of the founders and the leaders, says, we don't have such a department in Skype, period, because we don't believe that. But we have somebody that looks after people, but that is a fundamental different mindset. And then I also think it's about the difference between performance management systems, which is a very one-directional, the employees' performance need to be managed, versus value creation systems. Is how do employees create value for us, but how do we create value for them? It's not fundamentally different. We've known about learning pathways and all of these things, but it's a different nuance on the conversation. When an employee comes and sits around the table, we shouldn't ask, how do we measure your performance? We should ask, how can we create value for you so that you can be a happy employee, that you can create value for the organization? Many of the fund principles are the same, but the point of departure is different. And then the final one, for hundreds of years in business schools, we're teaching the students to sweat their assets. But yet, if we look at the return on assets, or ROA, in American businesses over the last 50 years, we find that it's moved from an average of around 4% to dipping below 1%. And no doubt within COVID now we'll probably get a negative. But the trend is very, very clear. And that's where I would like to conclude on this afternoon. We need to sweat the ecosystems to co-create value. And I'm not can't go into the detail of ecosystems thinking. That's an entire 45-minute slot all on its own. But the reality is that the boundaries are rapidly blurring in the business and in the industry environment. And a distinctive characteristics of many ecosystems that they form to achieve something together that lies beyond the effective scope and capabilities of any individual actor. And I promise it's the second last time that I will talk about IMBA today, but IMBA is such a brilliant example of me. Is no single business school, I can't care how powerful and how lovely the 10 business schools in this consortium is, not a single business school can put together this program that was put together this week. But it's not just the business school. We needed David, we needed Jose, we needed Ipek, and we needed the entire team. We needed Shana and all of the back-end people. So the ecosystem between different business schools, but also their ecosystem of alumni. Johan, that you've met on the previous session, if you attended that, is an alumni. That's part of our ecosystem. And only when Stellenbosch exploits its full ecosystem and then forms part of the IMBA ecosystem, can we then create something more. If we would create an IMBA virtual consortium week, and it would be exactly the same what we would do in the classroom, then we've not been successful. Then we're not applying the concept of ecosystems thinking. And I often wonder, did your MBA prepare you for that? Do you think in ecosystems? Do you think new about business models, about partnerships for allocated growth, building digital connectivity, new ways of measuring value? designing for systemic effects to ensure that things are sustainable. And I just put the Airbnb ecosystem there because it's such a lovely example of an ecosystem that has changed the face of leisure accommodation and to an extent business accommodation as well, purely by exploring the ecosystem, and we all know. Thank you, Roshana. So it's difficult to argue with examples. 6 of the world's top 7 companies are ecosystems companies. The one second from top is resources, and we all know the challenges that they are going through at the moment and all where they come from. But that's the reality of ecosystems companies. And when we do ecosystems thinking, we even have a maturity model. And that's what I would like to leave you today is it starts with partner cooperation. And partner cooperation is still very much firm orientated, but it concludes into value integration. When you are decentralized, autonomous, and we create value across the board. And I must admit, one of the reasons I wanted to be part of this virtual IMBA week, for me, it's a stunning move from IMBA, which was always intended to be ecosystem and really did fairly well in the past, to really now putting our money where our mouths are and doing something amazing. And when we look at ecosystems, thinking that the question we have to ask ourselves as consortium members, is it about an IMBA week, or should we be doing a global executive MBA with virtual components to reduce the real opportunity cost? Because then we are truly embracing what COVID has taught us and what we are able to do. So my final thoughts, digital transformation is becoming the new normal in the new normal. The COVID crisis, no doubt, presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reinvent the world. I think things that we thought were impossible 6 months ago seem surprisingly workable. And employees' desires for flexibility will enable companies to recruit and retain top talent. You may find somebody living in the Kruger National Park that can still work for you because the system allows you to do that. And being Johan and Gerard introduced themselves as process and mechanical engineers. I'm an electronic engineer. I love the technology guys, and I would like us all to take a bow to the IT geeks, because what a difference 25 years are making. Imagine COVID was COVID-95 and not COVID-19. We would only have the first very rudimentary web browsers, not eBay, Yazoo, Amazon, Alibaba, Wikipedia, Skype, Facebook, YouTube, iPhones, WhatsApp, Uber, Zoom, MS Teams. Add your own, add whatever you would like to add there. The technology transformation of the last 25 years has enabled us to a large extent to do a slightly new way of business. And I think it's fantastic that we were able to do that. Roshana, I think I have 2 minutes left. Apologies for that. But if there are any questions, please fire away. Extended by 5 minutes for the wrap up. Thank you, Roshana. So my last slide, I hope Charles Darwin forgives me. It's not the strongest of species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change. And I think that's true for organizations as well. Right, that's my story for today. Any questions? Hendrik Heinz wants to know if the Kruger are selling. Roshana, have you curated the questions as well, or should I just read them?
You can go straight ahead, Martin, but I just wanted you to please answer Hendrik Heinz's question.
Thank you so much, Hendrik. Kruger does not sell decent pinotage, but I drove down the coastline of South Africa, 4,000 kilos to get here, with 2 boxes of pinotage for the international students on the call. Pinotage, uniquely South African wine. Please support the wine farmers in South Africa. Zanele, I've noticed with the lockdown restrictions lifting, old habits resurface, people revert to the way of life as they know it. In fact, they demand it. Do you believe, do you believe that change, reactive ways of working will be long-lasting post-COVID, or will we see a gradual shift? Zanele, thank you. I think that's the fundamental question. Even if I answer that, just that question is, I don't think everything that needs to remain, Zanele. I think if I go back to the definition of innovation, the last element is value. That which is valuable should remain, and that which is not valuable, I think, should disappear. I think 6 months is a very long period, Zanele, for the social system to form. And I think if the social system has formed sufficiently around the valuable things, I truly believe most of them will remain intact. But I all think we miss sitting and having a cup of coffee with our friends and colleagues at work as well. And I think that need to come back. So I'm not overly concerned if you look at the theoretical models and the innovation diffusion theory and the social system. I think the valuable things will remain. What my bigger concern is, Anele, is not necessarily the people demanding, it's whether the management are adapting, and those in senior management positions are brave enough to make the calls that need to be made. Right, Murat, I would agree with the challenges with carrying out collaborative tasks. To give an example, when I started doing a team with my fellow, it was very difficult to develop relationships without having previously met face to face. I think we massively underestimate building relationships over a beer, wine, or hot chocolate. Murat, thank you so much. I still believe that the most successful online programs start with a physical presence, people meeting each other, sitting, having that hot chocolate, understanding everybody's context, single parents with small children, young urban professionals, which are extremely career-driven, when you understand everybody's context to board. So thank you, Murat, confirming just what I've said. So Nelle said there's that one. Paul says, you've mentioned William Gibson. Do you think the 1995 film, a great book ahead of its time in so many ways? Paul, yes, thank you. For those of you that have not read the work of William Gibson or seen the movie, science fiction is what we think the future would be like. And there are so many things, you know, if you look at the Motorola flip phone, the idea came from Star Trek communicator. So quite often those writing science fiction depict idealistic futures, which we then aspire and strive towards. So do I think that the new Monster Justice? Yes, I think so, Paul. I think it really did. Right. I think Lihani says, do you think there will be significant changes? Lihani, my apologies. Rushana is giving me the time out. Rushana, can I deal with Lihani's question? Final question from Lihani. Do you think there will be significant changes needed in companies' vision, missions, and value statements adapting to the new normal after COVID? I don't necessarily think so. I think that the changes is probably more within the operating model, the configuration of the ecosystem. I think the nature of these visions and missions, that they are quite often highly aspirational. And sometimes when you read them, you snigger and think, how on earth can you achieve that? So I don't necessarily think so. I think I love it when it's highly aspirational. And I think the reconfiguring of the ecosystems and operating model can probably get us closer to delivering realistically on these grandiose visions and missions that we sometimes set. I don't necessarily think so. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rushana. Enjoy the rest of your Embark Consortium. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Have a lovely day.